Today, we wanted to talk to you about debt. It's such a hot topic, and everyone has an opinion. But Coach Jason and myself, we wanted to talk about what we have experienced and how we live our lives in reaching financial freedom even sooner. So, debt. What does debt mean to you, Jason?
Oh, what does it really mean? I don't know. I've seen so many different faces of debt. And like you said earlier, everybody's got a different opinion on debt, right? Good debt, bad debt, 0% debt is okay, but high interest credit cards are not okay. Mortgages are okay, but like there's all these different things. And whatever, for me, it's when I work with clients and when I'm sitting down with people trying to help them with their financial freedom or their ideal lives, we talk about their debt. And the first thing I always say is whatever your opinion on debt is, that debt always brings risk. It always brings risk, even at 0%, even at 0%, even with an asset attached to that debt. There's always some kind of risk. So I talk about risk a lot, and everybody's got different levels and calibers of risk. Some people are more risk adverse than others, and that's okay. And other people like throw caution to the wind. So it really depends. So, but to me, I always bring it back to risk when I'm talking to people.
That's perfect. Perfectly said, because it really doesn't matter what my opinion is on debt or what yours is, who's right, wrong, good, bad. It doesn't matter because all debt brings some level of risk. Exactly what Jason's saying. Now, let's go with the example of a car loan at 0% interest rate, because that's a pretty common one. If I can get a car at 0%, the question for you, Jason, that people often ask both of us is, if I have that same money invested, let's go with $50,000. I have $50,000 invested, and that gives me a rate of return of 6%, and I can go out and borrow that 50,000 on a car at 0%. Why would I not do that?
Yeah. So that is very common, especially in like down economies. Car companies use these 0% interest rates as a marketing tactic. And so I actually have a blog post on that on my website. But also, I think that we have to realize that this is not just the number game, right? We're human beings with real lives and real consequences and real situations that come up. And so when you talk about something like this scenario, this is a fake scenario, but it does happen where, in a down economy, somebody will offer you a 0% car loan, and you can borrow 30, 40, 50, $60,000 at 0% for 6 years. And let's say you do have some money and you wanted to, instead of pay cash for the car, you'd go and invest that in the stock market. Well, the problem with that is there's risk on that end too. It doesn't always make money. The stock market doesn't always make money, and the 0% doesn't always work. And while you might do that deal and have a good experience at the end of it, saying, yeah, I would do that all the time, it doesn't always work. And that's one of those stories that Mike, you and I have talked about in our journey of life. Is I bought a house in California, and it was considered a good deal because the housing market was going bananas in the 2000s, the early 2000s. And I thought I was sitting pretty, right? The whole plan that I had was buy the house, get in, see it go up, and then sell it for a big profit, and then go buy another one, and then flip that one, and then like continue up this ladder of financial wealth being. And it didn't really work out. I lost $250,000 on that house. And that's something that, like, okay, well, in a different market, in a different time, in a different space, that could have worked out, and I would have had two thumbs up, like, yay, I made $100,000 on profit. But it doesn't always work out. And that's why debt always brings risk, because you don't know what the stock market is going to do. You don't know what interest rates are going to do. You don't know what housing prices are going to do. You don't know what inflation is going to do. So that's why, like, yes, it could work out, but it doesn't always work out. And you have to be okay with taking the risk. So you have to know the risk. That's what I would say. I would share that story with people for sure. What about you?
And exactly, we had started about talking with cars, and then now you're talking about houses, right? So car loans and mortgages, but this happens with any debt, family loans, credit cards. I'll give you 0% interest on a credit card for 12 months. Well, what you don't read, or what people don't pay attention to, is the fine print, which is on that credit card at the end of the 12 months. they can back pay all the interest if you don't have that thing paid off.
Yeah. And a lot of people,
This happens with furniture as well.
yeah, a lot of people don't understand that, where if you miss that 12-month period, cutoff period, and you're short on cash that last month, for example, and you're like, well, there's only $200 left on my loan on this iPhone or Android or couch or bed, that if you miss one payment, if you miss that last payment, they will go back and back charge you that 20 something percent interest the entire time. And that's the fine print you're talking about that people don't realize. And again, that's pretty rare that you're going to do that, who's watching, but there are plenty of people out there that do that. And that's why these companies use these 0% interest loans as marketing tools. They want to get you into their store. They want to get you to purchase it now instead of waiting and paying cash for it, because they make money on this stuff. And it's not us just being on the soapbox because we are financial people. Like, this is real life and this happens. And we see hundreds and hundreds of people that we've worked with get stuck in these situations where they get back charged or they get penalized or they get these extra fees tacked on to their loans. I mean, it's happened to me bunches of times in my life before I, got out of debt and stayed out of debt, but for sure it happens. Mike, do you have a story or two that would be relevant here in your journey before you got to be debt free?
Yeah, sure. I was doing it mathematically. So I grew up, math has always been my thing, black, white. I have an engineering background. The math works. But what we're not doing is dealing with the emotional side, right? And I believe that finances, along with nearly every other area of our life, is an 80-20 rule, meaning it's only 20% head knowledge, right? The math works for 20% of it. 80% of it is the behavior, right? And that's where risk comes in. So no matter what your definition or your view on debt is, we can agree that it brings some level of risk. Even the 0% stuff, there is some level of risk. Because what happens when the stock market goes down or there's a housing crash and you lose your job that same month and your wife just got in a car accident and your dog just died? Like, all of these things can happen and happen often. That's not even the worst case scenarios. Those are bad. But what happens if your wife dies the same week you lose your job? Now, the probability of that is not high, but the risk is there. And if those things do happen, the bank doesn't care. They want their monthly payment every single month. They don't care what happens in your financial life. And most recently, with inflation being the hot topic, my life hasn't changed. Okay, it changed a little bit. Okay, I got to spend 10% more on groceries for how I purchase things. I might have to spend a little bit more on gas. But outside of that, I don't have an adjustable rate mortgage. I don't have a variable rate on my car loan. So it doesn't matter. My life hasn't changed. I still invest, and that still goes up over time.
Yeah. So I have a question then, Mike. So as we're talking, we're talking to the masses, but we're talking to the individual who's watching this conversation, listening to this conversation. So many people that I've run into get to the place where they understand, okay, yes, debt brings risk. I know that, right? I have these credit cards, I have this car loan, I have this student loan, I have this mortgage, but how do I get out? I don't understand how I can get out because I don't make enough money in order to just throw thousands of dollars at all of these debts and get rid of them. It's going to take me 10 years. Like, that's a real situation for a lot of people who are going to be watching here. So it's like, what do we need to do? What is a step-by-step, something simple? What kind of process would you use to say, all right, I want to get out of debt. I know I should get out of debt. I don't like the debt, but I seem to be stuck in this cycle. So what is the number one or number two things that we can help people on just how to get out of this debt process, this debt cycle?
Perfect question. Thank you for that. And the very first thing is directly related to the 80-20. So we're going to talk about, and what we teach you is the 20%, the head knowledge. But what the very first thing is the 80% of the behavior. So the very first thing you must do is decide to stop going into more debt. If you just simply decide, I'm never going to borrow money for anything again on this planet, then eventually you're going to become debt free. Even if you had a 30-year mortgage, if you do not refinance and you do not take on more debt, at end of 30 years, you're going to have your house paid for. That is the number one thing that I always teach my clients. And I want you to take away from this is just decide to not go into debt for anything again. And one of the things that I had to do when I made this decision was to live that. And I do that. Like, it just comes out of me. When I meet new people, like, I'm grounded, I'm calm, I do all these things is because I have my house in order. And my financial house in this conversation is I know, like, I am never going to borrow money for anything ever again, because there's nothing on this planet that I want more than the feeling of being debt free, of the feeling that companies are not going to call my phone, that I'm never going to have someone knock on my door because I owe money to someone. It's never going to happen. I never have to worry about that. When I go and lay down and go to sleep at night, I go to sleep. I don't worry about payments. All because I decided to get out of debt, not go into debt ever again. So that's the number one thing that I wanted to share.
Yeah.
And I know that you were kind of touching. Well, I want to let you respond to that, Jason. Go
Oh,
ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, playing devil's advocate a little bit here. Like, okay, so many people that we work with, they have very low incomes, and they can't just pay off their debt, even if they're not borrowing any more money, or maybe they can't even survive. They're not spending on luxurious cars and vacations and huge houses and all of those things, a bunch of jewelry. They literally just can pay their bills, if that. What would you say in that situation that people do? How do they get out of this cycle of poverty, really?
Yeah, and that is very real. Sometimes there is a paycheck to paycheck situation. Maybe you're only making $30,000 here in the U.S., and that's pretty low, doable but low. And you've got to you got to set boundaries in your life somewhere. Again, deciding to not get into debt. You're in this cycle for some reason. You either bought a car you couldn't afford, you're buying food that you shouldn't be, which is usually going out to eat. If you make $30,000 a year, well, I'd rather have a roof over my head than be able to go and take my family of four out to dinner every week or twice a week.
Yeah.
So you gotta set those boundaries. You gotta make the decision again to never borrow money, but you can't spend money you don't have.
Yeah.
You can't do things that are not in your budget, which is your income. So there's two sides of it, right? And you talk about it a lot, Jason, of income and outgo, right? So if your outgo is more than your income, there's two things to do. There's either you got to reduce your expenses or you've got to increase your income.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the biggest factor. And I just say this all the time, is there are only two ways to improve your financial situation: reducing your expenses or improving your income. And if you are at the place where you've reduced as much as possible, you're not going out to eat, you don't have that expensive car or that expensive house, you don't go on vacation. Like, if you literally can't reduce any more expenses, then you have to adjust one way or the other. You have to say, okay, maybe there's something that I'm not seeing or thinking of that I can reduce expenses for, or I need to look at ways I can increase income. And this is something that, Mike and I talk about all the time, is that we, especially in the Western world, we get caught up in these norms, I'm going to call them, in this is the only way I can live, is in an apartment or in a traditional housing. There are creative ways, and Mike can share stories for hours on how he has creatively gone about living his life without having any rent at all. No rent. How does he do it? Like, you can have a conversation with him, contact him about that. But here, especially in expensive places, I live in the Toronto area right now. I'm going to be moving to Vancouver. I've lived in California. There's Hawaii. There's all these places who are very expensive. So rent is, at least you cannot find a tiny apartment for less than $1,200, $1,300, $1,400. And I'm paying more than $1,800. Some places are paying $3,000 for rent. That's a huge amount of your income. But are there other ways rather than, well, then I can't find any cheaper ways, right? We talk about this all the time. I can't find anywhere else cheaper. This is the cheapest apartment I can find. There are creative ways so that you can do something different to sacrifice in order to change it so that maybe that rent isn't $3,000 or $2,000 or $1,500. There are ways to be creative about how you eat, how you cook, how you prepare your food. There are creative ways about clothing your children and going to school and driving a vehicle or not driving a vehicle. All these different creative ways to save money, reduce your expenses if you can. And then if you have tapped out all those resources, which you probably haven't, but if you have tapped that out, there are other creative ways in order to make some money. Even if it's just a couple $100s a month, that can change your life. It can change your life if you have a couple $100s that you can apply if you're in debt to that debt so that you can get out. Or if you don't have debt, congratulations, that's awesome. But you can use that couple $100s to springboard you to live the life that you really want to live. I think that's the thing that we as coaches, we help you find creative ways to reduce your expenses and or increase your income. And I think that's something that, we've found throughout the years is helping people to do those types of things instead of stuck in that rut of this is the only way to live. I can't get out of this cycle. There are certain circumstances that will prevent you from doing it. So if you've got an illness or you've got something going on where you can't work or whatever, there are those. But the majority of us, we just have these choices that we're not making or we're not thinking of. And so that's what coaching is really all about, is helping you see a different perspective so that you can do something and change your life.
Yep. Getting creative is key. Exactly what Jason was saying about me and how I've been able to be creative in having no rent or very low rent over the last 6 years or more. And the options that I've chosen to do, sacrifices, if you will. But I think that all choices have pros and cons to them. And you've got to make that choice. Only you can do it.
Yeah. And I think, as we bring this back, like we're talking about debt, and I know we've kind of taken some rabbit trails, but it's all tied together. And when we're talking about debt and risk and sacrifices and all that, I also like to use the question. So a lot of times, especially financial professionals will say, well, what are you willing to sacrifice, right? What are you willing to sacrifice in order to build that wealth or to get out of debt or to, build your investments or to have that house or that car or go on vacations, right? We always ask about what are you willing to sacrifice? I have added onto that saying, what are you not willing to sacrifice? So sometimes in order to get out of debt, you put the pedal to the metal and you get out really quickly. Like some people are just like, I'm going to get out of this as fast as possible. And that's awesome. And some people are like, wait a second. If I do that and sacrifice the job that I have or the family that I have or my marriage, or I have to sell the house that I'm in or whatever, like those are extreme sacrifices. You have to determine for you what you're not willing to give up. So for example, like if I wanted to get out of debt, I could go get another job, but would that sacrifice time with my family when my children are young? Or would that really put a stress on my marriage and maybe my marriage is in jeopardy? Like I'm going to determine that my family and my marriage and my health and all those things are actually more important than debt. We're not saying that debt is the most important thing you need to get out of. Like obviously there are certain situations that you're not going to sacrifice your marriage. You're not going to sacrifice the health of your children or yourself for that. Like you can take a little bit longer if it's going to keep your marriage together or your family together, obviously. So you have to determine what you're not willing to give up, even as you're determining what you are willing to give up or sacrifice to get to the goals that you're trying to get, whether it's paying off debt or that house or that car or the life that you want. I just wanted to add that on there because there's a lot of times, a lot of people will preach out there saying like, you sacrifice everything in order to get to this financial goal. But like we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, like this is just money. This is not life. Like we believe life is more important than the numbers, and you have to balance and mix those together when you're talking about, okay, well, how long is it going to take me? Is it going to take me 2 years to get out of debt, 3 years to get out of debt, 10 years to get out of debt? we make those choices of what we are willing to give up, but then also what we're not willing to give up for those goals.
Certainly. And I was one of the people that I thought I went extreme, but now that I look back at it, I could have went even more extreme. But in that period of time, I did what I was willing to give up and what I was not willing to give up. And I still was able to get out of debt in 2 years.
Yeah.
Now, everyone has a different definition of what the extreme is.
Yeah.
Right. That everyone has a different view of what that looks like. What I do want to make sure that you do is don't get lazy when you do want to get out of debt, or when it comes to finances, of any caliber. We as humans can do anything for 90 days. And if it takes 90 days to find $10,000 to pay off that car, well, I recommend it, because after that 90 days, you don't have to work as hard or as long, and you don't have a car payment.
Yeah.
90 days is all it takes.
Yeah.
For one of those things to go away.
Yeah. And if you found a way to make $10,000 in 90 days, we would love to hear that story, because that would be really helpful for a lot of people. But even if it's not $10,000 in 90 days and it's $10,000 over a year, because you got a second job that you work 5 or 10 hours a week, at nights, on weekends, early in the mornings, like whatever it could be, or you started a side hustle and you made $1,000 a month, and it would take you, a year to make 12 grand. Like anything like that is progress. And that's what we are all about, is to help you make progress in the direction you want to go, so that you can start living your ideal life. That is our goal. So we have two goals when we are talking about with our clients. And one is to get on the path to financial freedom. And the other, probably most importantly, is to start living your ideal life. And you can do that really soon. In fact, you can start doing that now, even if you're in debt, even if you're not organized with your money, even if you don't have a lot of cash reserves. Like, we can help you start living that ideal life. But if you don't know what that ideal life looks like, how are you going to live it? So we need to get you on the path to financial freedom. And we also want you to start living your ideal life now, so that you can actually start getting more and more and more and more into that ideal life. And it'll change over time. And that's okay. That's great. But those are our two goals. And that's why we bring up topics like this and talking about debt, because debt will prevent you from living that ideal life. It's actually a facade, because you'll say, well, if I get that nice car or that nice house on loan at 0%, I am living my ideal life because I'm going to be driving that awesome car. Well, yes, but that's a temporary faux life, because while you have that nice car that you're driving around that you feel good about, you're dragging along that payment. And even if it is 0% or 1% or 2%, it doesn't really matter. You're bringing that risk, and you're taking that risk along with you every day, whether it's in your mind or whether something happens, like Mike was saying earlier, the economy turns down, you lose your job, you lose the house, your health deteriorates. Any of these things accentuate that risk when you have those debt payments. So like, we just really want you to pay attention to like what reality is. It's not just about the numbers. It's about that risk and that emotion that you're dragging along with you with any kind of debt. So I don't know. In summary, Mike, do you have any like last words you want to say about the debt or about the risk that you want to leave this conversation with?
The last thing I would share is my experience of living my ideal life. Now, we all have that definition, and it's going to be different for everyone. Same with financial freedom. We all have a different definition of financial freedom. But I've been living my ideal life for, I bet you, over 10 years. And it all started after I got out of debt. And it cleared space in my mind to have different opportunities, or to think differently, or be more creative, or be open to receiving more experiences. And there's been multiple years, more than one, that my wife and I, so two people, have traveled on $20,000 a year. We lived our life on less than some of you pay rent and mortgages on.
And you're not talking
really cool spaces.
Yeah, you're not talking about like you lived on the street and you ate out of garbage cans and things like that, right?
No. The first time we did that was we drove around Australia in a 4-wheel drive in a rooftop tent, which was planned. That was our goal. Loved it. Then another year, we got the opportunity to live on Fraser Island, which is the largest sand island in the world. And we actually got paid for that but we spent well less than 20 grand for that year. So
Hmm.
that 7 months that we were working there, the income covered all of our expenses for the year, and we got to live on the beach, and we didn't have to pay for it.
Hmm.
We actually got paid to live on the beach. That's just two of the experiences.
Yeah.
You can, and that's just how we have found in being creative. We meet people all the time that are creative in different ways. We're currently living in an RV. And once the RV is purchased, it really doesn't cost that much to live. Now, when it comes specifically to traveling, can it be expensive? Absolutely. We met people, woo, would have spent $500,000 just getting set up easily. And that could be in the cars, trucks, RVs, easily spent that. And that's on top of their home that they just do this 3 months out of the year. We live in the RV currently, right? So again, once the RV is purchased, there's not a lot of expenses
Yeah.
for us. And it comes down to choice.
Yeah. I think that's what we were talking about earlier, and we'll wrap up here. But I think you were talking about earlier about defining your ideal life, because what you're describing is actually you're living your ideal life. You couldn't be really happier at this point. And other people would be like completely like put off on that, like, oh, I have to live in an RV. Like, no, thank you for that. That sounds like a nightmare rather than their ideal life. Or having to work on, a ranch or something, property to in lieu of paying rent, for example. Like that sounds like not an ideal life for other people, which is why we keep talking about you have to define what your ideal life looks like. And then if your ideal life does look like luxurious trips and fancy houses and cars and all that stuff, that's totally fine. But you have to be in reality to know, okay, well, if I have that kind of life, then the income that I need to bring in is significantly higher than somebody who wants to live in an RV on the beach and traveling around and only paying for gas and electricity and things like that. That's a very different life. So if you want a huge house and fancy cars and trips all over the place, $20,000, of expenses is not really for you. But then what do you have to do? You have to make different choices than something like Mike is talking about here. They're making choices based on their value system, and you have to make choices based on your value system. So yeah, that's one of those things. And again, back to the whole debt thing. We just have to realize when if you are borrowing your way to your ideal life, it might feel good in the moment, or it might feel good in the short term, but it always comes back to that risk, and it'll come back to bite you if things don't go exactly how you think they're going to go. And for the most part, there's a high probability that things don't go exactly how you plan them to go, because you don't know what you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't control everything. You can control how you respond. So I don't know, Mike and I recommend like eliminate that risk from your life. Get out of debt if you can. If you need a plan to get out of debt, you can contact us. You can go through our programs and the things that we have to offer. And it's just when you're out of that cycle, it's so much easier to live, and it's so much better to make different decisions. And you actually have so much more wiggle room to make mistakes, because we make mistakes all the time. We're financial people, but it doesn't mean that we're perfect with our money, by any means. So but not having that debt, it softens the blow of these money mistakes that we make. So I would spend X amount of money, and I ended up overspending. Well, I can make up for that because I don't have all those payments. I'm dragging those payments behind. It's like I'm always strapped for cash. Like if that's what you're living in, and this cycle, you just don't have any wiggle room to make those mistakes. So the best way to get out of that is to get out of debt, and to stay out of debt, and to make different choices, and all the things that we've been talking about. Gosh, friends, it's been awesome to chat with you, to help you just listen in on our conversation. Mike and I always enjoy, just chatting about these things. And we do this because we want to see people live their ideal lives, get on the path to financial freedom. Mike, any closing thoughts about how we can help other people that are listening, watching?
No. Remember, decide to get out of debt, never to go back in. And then 2, eliminate that risk.
If you need help trying to get out of debt, or to get on a path to financial freedom, start living your ideal life, this is where our Ideal Life and Money Academy comes in. This is a private membership group that we do live coaching calls on. We have a library of resources, videos, tips, tricks, tools
we're able to get you to reach financial freedom and start living your ideal life years, if not decades earlier. So be sure to check out the link below, and we'll see you in the membership.